essential. The fact that all space is not filled, that allows one atom to move into that space, and thus, you could have respiration. And this is a very crude analogy, but you kind of get the feeling of it, right?
No, but it's very good, because there would be no exchange of elements that create everything. One little electron couldn't be taken off from something else and combined.
Correct. It would have nowhere to go. Everything would be filled. And especially since we have, if you start reading into some of the things like Buckminster Fuller's excellent book, Synergetics, you find that synergistic effects exist all over the planet, and that we have to wrap our head around them in a different way in order to really grasp what's going on. So, for instance, he always got bent out of shape by people saying, well, up or down. And it's like, okay, up or down relative to what? The sun or earth or whatever. And you have to state your point of reference, so you can't easily just bandy about these terms. So he preferred in or out, in the sense of you're either closer to the center of the earth, therefore heading in, or you're out further away from it, rather than any kind of an up or down reference, which assumes a universal plane upon which everything is occurring, and that's not the case. Make sense?
Yeah, so that's why our Chinese puzzle has one empty square.
Correct.
And then we get to choose.
And without that, of course, nothing moves. Everything's boxed in.
Right.
Okay, and now that would occur even if you look at the universe from like the electric universe plasma theories and the Paul Liouville's electric universe kind of conception. If we're all energetic beings, which I actually think is much closer to the truth, and in fact these little micro-miniature rocks that we think of as atoms don't really exist in that sense, we still nonetheless have the ability to lock everything up without space, if you will, to allow the expansion of the energetic waves. The energy is bound and is fused into basically it just sits there and vibrates without going anywhere. And we still have, we would have no movement and no possibility for growth or any of that. Now, in this case, some of these crop circles or these glyphs are deliberately encoding various levels of differential information at layers of, how do I want to say this, at layers of analysis. So in other words, you first take a look at the alien super glyph with all of the encyclopedic stuff, and you say, oh, really cool, it looks like X. And then the second glance you say, that ovoid shape, that's not really a teardrop, that looks like one of those space alien faces, one of the grays. And then the third glance, and so on. At each one of those layers, you'll find that there's differential information encoded in it. That alien face, for instance, is not directly dead-centered, looking directly away from the center alignment of the structure over its head, so to speak. And you can look at it and see that its gaze is off. And its gaze is actually off by the complement of the 618 golden mean. So there's various different levels of mathematics encoded in these things too. Now, what it all means is really anybody's guess, and probably some kid will come along licking an ice cream cone and say, oh, geez, let the air out of the tires, and we'll all be illuminated as to what the thing means.
Yes.
Everybody's heard the old thing about the semi getting stuck in a bridge, and they just can't figure out how to get it out from underneath the bridge, and the kid with an ice cream cone comes along and says, well, just, lower the tires.
Yes.
Well, I would think that our subconscious knows what it means, and I think you're quite right, because children are so still open to that part of the mind that, yeah, they would, it's again back in history, like when the people before they had language and thoughts in word forms, it was all visual imagination, of like a hologram.
Correct, and our language, true, even today, 60+ % of the language or communication is nonverbal. And so really the purest form of language in one sense, or communication, is what we have going on here with radio, where visual impressions don't add that extra 60%, and we're forced to really choose our words carefully to try and communicate the ideas that we want. Because in some other areas, face-to-face conversations, you can get in there and gesture with your hands and create other kinds of images that communicate further the nature of what you're trying to get across. And that is their challenge. And that is, we're a bunch of guys that don't even know what the obelisk is for yet, and yet it must communicate with us, apparently.
Okay, this is a good time to give you a listener question. This is from Sue, and she wants to know what you know about or what you think about the feathered glyphs.
Well, that's a kind of a strange one. I'll tell you about the immediate impression of it was that it was the headdress part of it anyway was relative to the Southwest Aboriginal cultures that in North America. Now, further examination shows that it also includes what we would think of as Mayan or Aztec. So there's a whole lot of that symbology inherent in there. Then I have some friends of mine that are in the local tribes that are in the Salish tribe, and then I've also sent it off to to a guy who's a member of the Sioux tribe, although that's not really their name. And he speaks a subset, which is the Lakota, and their symbology in there. And I've gotten some interesting takes on both of these. For instance, the two halves of that headdress can be easily split. And this is, by the way, the crop circle that was labeled July 5th, I think. It's in the UK off cropcircleconnectors.com. But the headdress is split with two central feathers that appear to face each other. The local Salish call this touching bones. And it's a particular headdress style that they don't really use, but that some of their relatives had encountered in other what they call Badlands tribes. And the touching bones indicated that it was a chief in a rather, shall we say, agitated state. In other words, that kind of a headdress would not be worn to a peaceful potluck, but might be worn to a gathering of individuals who are about to discuss a problem, and you basically are telling everybody you're a raspy bastard and they'd better not poke you when you sit down. And it's sort of a little bit of a warning. And then we go on from there. Now, what's really curious, of course, is the image in the middle of it is representative of what a lot of people, and myself included, think is the return of Quetzalcoatl. The Quetzalcoatl image shows up repeatedly in just that kind of a form, and this is a very, very good two-dimensional representation of three-dimensional objects that I've seen in Mexico. I mean, instantly it stands out, and you start to get that shivers down the middle of your back. Then there's the other real problem here. Go onto YouTube and start looking at this video called Symbols of an Alien Sky, about when the universe was not quite so regular in its orbital patterns, and there was all kinds of electrical activity. And that's where a lot of these mythological associations of things, including some of these symbols, arose. And in fact, this video, which was made sometime in the past, might be years ago for all I know, you'll see images in there that you will actually see in crop circles that have appeared in the last 2 months. And they all relate to weird alignments of the planets and electrical discharges between the planets. And some people may not be aware of this, but the large canyon on Mars that exceeds our Grand Canyon by many times its length and mass is an identical, it's scaled-up version of the fractal kind of damage one gets from a lightning strike or a giant electrical arc discharge in certain types of carbon-saturated sands. And we also see that the Grand Canyon, however much people may think of it as an erosion kind of an issue with the river in there, may in fact actually have been the result of an electrical scarring on our planet, and then the river found that channel rather than the river creating the channel. And it also, from space, resembles electrical scarring seen in this cavern on Mars, both of which can be replicated in models with electric arcs and sand and so on.
Whoa, that's really cool. We do have to take another break. Sorry, folks. We'll be back with Clif on Beyond the Ordinary right after this.
Okay, back with Clif on Beyond the Ordinary.
And where we left off was the Quetzalcoatl mask. And Quetzalcoatl is an interesting figure in the Mayan, and he's represented through the Aztec and the Inca also. There's a same theme with the same kind of linguistics that show up, same symbology for apparently different individuals. But in any event, the Mayans had the civilization builder tag to this fellow, but also were aware that there was an element of association to catastrophe. Not that this is necessarily a cause, but may have actually been an effect in the sense of after the catastrophe arose Quetzalcoatl, who came along and told us how to build our houses up again, that kind of deal. But in any event, Lakota and Salish individuals that have had a look at these, particularly this headdress one, they don't feel too comfortable with it. It actually creeped them out a bit. And there's some hyperdimensional symbology underneath the headdress, which is the counter-rotating stylized spires in the form of the little elongated wings, if you will, that form around the headdress. And that counter-rotation issue is a hyperdimensional clue that you also see showing up in some of the Bilderbergers, although and other Illuminati kind of publications, although you'll frequently see it not in a stylized form like this, but in an actual representation of something spinning wheels and counter-rotating wheels and this sort of thing. So the level of information in this particular glyph is going to really require a lot of examination. We also notice that there's a series of dots and irregular notches cut into the feathers, so obviously some level of code is being communicated there. And then we note that the feathers are uneven on each side, one side having 16, one having 15. Then there's other differentials that say, come and look at me, count this and measure that, this sort of thing, which I have yet to get to this one. It's rather complex. I was just working my way through the theoretic or rather assumed Chinese characters that are showing up in the more encyclopedic glyphs. It's kind of like, I was paying attention to the crop circles this year, and they've given us far too much work to do.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, they're just popping off right and left, and they're all very complex, and they've got all these various little subtext running in them. And, like I say, you can no sooner start wrapping your head around one, and then the next one appears.
Well, part of the conclusion of this one we began speaking about that you have examined is the galactic
alignment,
central alignment, and it ends up on the date in 2012 at 11:11 a.m.
Right.
Now, whose time zone is that? GMT or?
No, that's actually Club of Rome time. That's time originating from what was known as the Rose Line, which ran through Paris.
And then that goes into is that where all the talk and possible symbology or synchronicity of the 11:11 as pillars comes from?
Yes. There's another subtext that we need to be aware of. That 11:11 conclusion on AM on December 21, 2012 was originated through Pope Gregory, who hired a German mathematician who hired a huge crew of guys, and they all sat around and adjusted the Justinian and Gregorian calendars until they aligned up at this particular time for that particular event, which was the end of the long count. There's a lot of supposition, which I favor, that they did not do this mathematically, but had some aid, that is to say, some books that were presumed burned or broadcast out as having been burned, but were not, and in fact have been stored in the Vatican. And within our data